Honneur and respect to all those present. Thank you to the Godbox Foundation, Panifest, and all organizers, especially Dr. Gilbert Kobina Buhari, for inviting me here today. And we send heartfelt congratulations to Dr. Iba Carruthers, Nana Aba Mentuma the First, Development Queen of Ogua Traditional Council. Aibobo to you and to all Panifest Interfaith Day 2025 speakers. I'm Her Royal Majesty Queen Mother Dr. Dowoti Desir, Queen Mother of the African Diaspora, Benin Republic. And while I make my remarks, I ask that you hold a couple of images in your head. A ball or a sphere that you imagine turning around and examining. So it's turning. Or the other possibility is a spiral, like the DNA chain that is in our bodies. Keep those images in your mind's eye. We descendants of Africa and members of the global diaspora have a complex history, and the imposition of foreign religious and governing systems, the contraction of social space, whether topographical, epistemological, or theological, has resulted in psychic wounds and secondary traumas in our communities. But it has also birthed new paths of thought and created new spaces. In this context, the pursuit of spatial and social justice and spiritual reconciliation is not only necessary, but urgent. Now, the revolutionary changes taking place on the African continent manifest in the Alliance of the Sahel, led by Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger, are catalytic and make us witnesses to the overdue dismantling of the colonial experiment. And like those leaders, we, traditional authorities, are governors of our people's sensibilities, their welfare and well-being. We are their defenders. But unlike those leaders, many of us on the panel are largely from the African diaspora. So our responsibilities include being the guardians of the cultural patrimony of peoples on two sides of the Atlantic and perhaps also of the Sahara. So we too must consider incorporating changes reflective of the type of prophetic leadership our presence on the continent represents. And unlike those leaders, outside of prayer, we really don't have the full arsenal of tools to protect our people. But given our numbers, our critical massing makes the diaspora's presence on the African continent a revolutionary one. So how can we make the most of that for each other? Remembering that we have a responsibility to not only stay relevant, but to maintain our fidelity to the oaths made towards fulfilling our ancestral sacerdotal duties. Spirituality and traditional governance is now a geostrategic matter. My point here is that there is a complex relationship between the political and the sacred spaces of governance. And the laws of most lands, as we know, are based in spiritual systems. But this notion is intensified for African-centered thinkers whose haptic receptivity to life does not segregate spirituality and spiritual praxis from other aspects of being. As a Queen Mother of the African diaspora and a voodoo priest who is an interfaith leader, my bigger concerns focus on transnationalism. I question how nations are defined not just as geopolitical entities, but as theological constructs. How is sacred space defined in an interfaith context where we have practitioners whose perspectives might be antithetical to one another? Namely the eco-theological sacred sciences of Voodoo, Ifa, Bwiti, Umbanda, versus the religions of the book, including the theologies of liberation born in those spaces. But also, what is our relationship to civil society on the African continent? I know we have time restrictions and there's other constraints, but I want to raise a few key questions and point some things out. Over the years, within my scholarship, I have taken issue with the notion of God and place. God and place. Concluding that God, however named, has been both a tool and a witness of the processes of conquest, displacement, deprivation, and discourses of domination that have been imposed upon us. And for African descendants, our past forced dispersals have fractured concepts of the divine, pitting ontologies and epistemologies against each other, furthering the divisions already generated by the Berlin Congo Congress of 1885, and exacerbating the fissures proclamated in the Americas by anti-superstition campaigns, Afrophobia, pogroms against, and criminalization of African-based religions. These are brutal matters that speak to the complexity of who we are as sacred persons and perhaps God's complicity in this unfolding. In the context of colonial settler states, the divine has become the OG, or perhaps more accurately, the God. Not God, God, as we commonly understand it, but the G period, O period, D period, the geographer of denial, God. That force that marks the territories of exclusion, which legitimize the contraction of social and sacred spaces, especially of melanin-rich people, under the pretext of being God's will. It is my hope that during this discussion on sacred thrones, stools, and sacred texts, that we not only reclaim and expand the roles of governance amongst traditional chieftaincies, but that we resolve to interrogate and resist processes that impede the possibility of an interfaith Pan-African future reflective of the multi-tiered, multi-radial reality that is Black religiosity. And I want you to understand that when I use the word Black, it isn't simply a racial category or an ethnic group, but a sacred frequency. Black is a sacred frequency. And I pray that we will all walk away with richer meanings of a Godhead. Remembering the thrones, stools, scriptures, and oral traditions and contemplative practices that we all represent have distinct geographies, physical and metaphysical, attached to them. And they're attached in the time-space continuum. We have Canaan, we have Zion, we have Guinea, Vilocan, Jerusalem, Abyssinia, the Garden of Eden, the realm of the ancestors, Jannah, paradise, heaven, just to name a few. So we can't forget that just as there was a scramble for the African continent in the 19th century, there is an aggressive scramble for African souls in the 21st century by various proselytizers. And I mentioned the Sahelian Alliance, which means that we now have a much more multipolar geopolitical reality that we live in. And that means that we have to have a transnational consciousness, all of us. Now, transnationalism, for those who don't know, is recognized as the simultaneous connection and interaction between two or more national places inhabited by people, economies, values, ideas, histories, technologies, etc. And Africans in the diaspora are inherently transnational beings, bound by shared languages, knowledges, material culture, political alliances, for instance, that transcend geographic boundaries. And this polycultural sensibility, is both the legacy of forced displacement, but it's at the same time a resource for creative agency and spiritual renewal. These factors facilitate the development and growth of the multi-tiered, multi-radial spaces spoken of. Other influencing elements are how God's presence or absence is more evident in the world today by way of technology. To say the least of the impact of words of wisdom or sometimes misinformation from any number of religious or spiritual practitioners on Instagram and TikTok or other social media sites. But for better or worse, their presence widens our sacred horizons. Now, if technologies and geopolitics and social interactions are evolving, is spiritual practice and traditional governance immune to change? Is it possible that Black spirituality, our AI, ancestral intelligence, is growing more elastic and less doctrinaire, less orthodox? And our very conversation today, is that a reflection of that? The historic forced displacement and now voluntary repatriation of Africans in the Americas and elsewhere to the African continent or other majority black spaces creates the need for a more nuanced conversation among us. The dual consciousness of hope and collective suffering of African descendants, including statelessness, chronic deportation, deracination, enslavement, colonization, and mass incarceration, reflects the renunciation of historic geographies and spiritual belonging, but also the geo-spiritual imperatives that we are confronted with. The geo-spiritual imperatives that we are confronted with. Our temples, churches, mosques have long served as sanctuaries of knowingness. Yet as Pan-Africanists, we must address if and how our doctrines problematically prioritize the personhood of one group of people over another, keeping us in a perpetual space of imbalance, failing to see the essence of what binds us in favor of the blindness of its form. And this is an issue for the sacred thrones and sacred stools that we sit on. So crowned heads, especially those who are from, have lived or worked in the African diaspora and know something of its history, we have a very specific role to play. And we have to educate the other crowned heads that we work with, but also allow ourselves to be further enlightened. Tutoring and mentoring the populations under our collective jurisdiction about the unexcavated layers of our stories, not his stories, but our stories, that meta-narrative in the multiverse that connects our souls to what is divine within each of us. We have to craft public policies for spiritual reparations of our communities, enable reconciliation among us, and prepare spaces for envisioning new societies together. And I do mean creating new societies together. Some of us in the diaspora have civilizations that are over 500 years old, and we have invented new clothing, cuisines, redefined our spiritual practices, dances, gender dynamics, language, etc. And we've done so in such an extraordinary way, even as these things remain grounded in Africa, right? But we cannot and we should not surrender those things that are most dear to us. We can't do that in the name of assimilation, all right? But at the same time, we have to be ready to make some compromises. Conversely, African nationals must be prepared to do some hand-holding, do some deep listening, teach, be patient, and also be ready to make compromises too. As Queen Mothers, Kings, Nanas, Obas, Pojitos, Paramount Chiefs, and so on, we are the guardians of tradition. But traditions get redefined as culture, a living, breathing human phenomena, evolves and changes. And the task before us is to nurture and usher those changes towards the greater good. So let us roll up our sleeves, right? Adjust our headgear and get to work. Get to work in love, respect, and solidarity. Ayibobo.